It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein and the railroaded Robert Begley. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably Robert Begley. How you doing today, Robert?
I'm doing great, Andy. Boy, talk about railroads. Today's hero is right out of Atlas Shrugged. In so many ways, we'll give you some chapter and verse on the achievements of this man. Super excited for today, Andy.
Yeah, no, yeah, and railroaded not in the sense of being, pushed into some,
No,
undeserved
no.
punishment, right? But railroaded in the sense of celebrating probably the greatest railroad builder in history, and that, of course, is the immortal James J. Hill, James Jerome Hill,
Mhm.
1838 to 1916, who is very famous, of course, for building the Great Northern Railroad,
That is
opening
right.
up the American Northwest to all kinds of
Mhm.
industry and agriculture. So yeah, James J. Hill is our subject for today, and we could drop the probably right greatest railroad builder in history.
Yes, I agree. I put, Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt started later in life. So did E.H. Harriman, but J.J. Hill just changed the way things were done, and nobody was like him. Absolutely nobody was like him. Born in a log cabin, Andy. That's the second hero we're covering, born in a log cabin, right? But this time in
and
Canada.
and in Canada, right?
Yeah.
But we
Hmm.
forgive him for that. You can't control your birth. Only Abraham Lincoln could do that, right? He was born in a log cabin that he helped his father build. But that's a
That's
pretty special trick.
yes.
So
Yeah.
born in a log
Instead,
cabin.
he'll
Go ahead.
he's 9 years old and he's shooting a bow and arrow. It snaps and the arrow goes right into his eye. Reminds
Ugh.
me of the Christmas story. You'll shoot your eye out, and that's kind of what he did. Shot his eye out. Fortunately, they put it back in, and the rest of his life he was blind in that eye. But if you look at him like this picture, you don't really see that. So, good job there of cosmetic surgery for him. A tough life. He was good at math, good in English, surveying, but father died when he was, young, maybe 11, 12 years old. And by the time he's 16, he makes his way out on his own to St. Paul, Minnesota. He wanted to go to the Orient, but stopped in St. Paul, and that's where he settled in for the better part of the rest of his life. Lots of transportation. It's on it's a hub, of course, for the Mississippi, if you know the geography. Andy, one time, I'll just say real fast, I did a trip of the Great Lakes. We flew into Fargo, and I wanted to go to exactly where the Mississippi starts. It's like a puddle, and I jumped over it just to say I jumped over the Mississippi. You know how many people have
The
done that in
fountainhead,
life?
the fountainhead of the Mississippi.
Exactly,
Where
yeah. So it's like in the
where
middle of
is it?
no
Is
this
it is it in Minnesota or is it up in Canada? Where
central,
is the
no,
headwaters?
central in the state. Yeah. I think Rochester, Minnesota is the biggest town on the Mississippi, but it's like in the middle of nowhere. You wouldn't go there unless you were aiming to go there, like for that purpose. But it was a transportation hub for shipping, literally shipping. And Hill just got involved right away with all the different industries as a boy, doing odd jobs, learning, super competent, workaholic, and worked his way up to the next phase of his life.
Yeah, speaking about work, I loved his motto when they asked him the secret
Yes.
of his success. I wrote this down. He said, "Work, hard work, intelligent work, and then more work." That was, and we've seen
What
this
words
theme
to live
come.
by.
Yeah, we've seen this theme come up over and over again on the Hero Show. Benjamin
Yes.
Franklin had similar
Yes.
sentiments. Frederick Douglass said things, very similar. And it's true. There's no escape. You want to be successful in some arena. There's no escape from that necessity.
And that's the story of his life. And he just, as he goes up, he had a couple of traits that he was good with money. He observed the big picture, and he saw what was happening in the Minnesota area, that it was a hub for transportation. Again, um, steamboat shipping via boats at the time because of the Mississippi. But he saw the opportunity with railroads, and whenever there was some kind of collapse and a railroad went bankrupt, there was one specific one, and Hill jumped right in. He jumped right in. He got a couple of investors, a couple of partners, and they bought the railroad. And he completely revamped it because he saw profit. He saw future growth. One another thing about Hill is that he never expanded too fast. He would build a line and then build people around it, build industry around it, so that it turned into a town, and then it could expand, and then he would go farther west. Initially, he
Yeah, he
wanted to
made
go up to Canada.
right. He made profit that way, which gave him funds to to expand even further. And the way
Yes,
Hill
and
built. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. That's all right, Andy. Go
Well,
ahead.
I was just going to say the way Hill built up the American Northwest is just an extraordinary story. I don't know if
Yes.
it's there may be parallels in other people's productive lives, but Hill, of course, I mean, the American Northwest is the 1880s, right? He was roughly 1883 to 1893. I think he built the Great Northern
Hmm.
from St. Paul, Minnesota
Yes.
to Seattle, Washington,
To
and
Seattle. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, yeah, and that was the Little Bighorn, the Custer, massacre was well
Yes.
in 1876 maybe. It
Hmm.
wasn't that long before the Sioux Nation were hostile, formidable warriors. I don't know if they'd
Hmm.
been if they'd already been defeated by the U.S. Army and pushed onto the reservations by the 1880s. It's possible the Great Plains Wars with the American Indians were possible over by that time. But prior to
Hmm.
that, this was a lot of hostile tribes: the Sioux, the Cheyenne.
Yes.
These are real formidable warlike tribes. But anyhow,
Hmm.
the American Northwest was not built up. That is nothing like it was today. And so he'll realize, like you
No.
said, Robert, we need farms along the way and industry. And so
Yes.
he initiated a program. What did he encouraged immigrants, especially from Scandinavian countries, because they were used to that kind of
Scandinavian
climate.
countries, cold weather.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, cold
Hmm.
weather, exactly
Hmm.
right. Was it $10? He
ten
initiated that
bucks.
program,
Yeah.
$10 to
That's right.
emigrate from Scandinavia, and then to America, and he transported them out to the Northwest on his railroad, sold them farmland inexpensive. He bought land from the U.S. government. He wasn't getting land grants, as I recall, he
No.
bought the land from the U.S. government and then sold it inexpensively to the immigrants so that they could farm. I mean, it's extraordinary, and
Yeah.
and the farms built up, around his line, right around the Great Northern, which
That's
was
right.
great for the immigrants. They had
Yes.
inexpensive access to fertile lands. Great for Hill. He now had freight traffic to ship, and he
Hmm.
bought he bought companies and then and then he opened up he moved them to along his line and opened plants in proximity. So again, there was industry,
Yes.
industrial development there, so that Hill
Yeah.
had freight traffic, and the area started to thrive. There's industry, there's agriculture, and this was a real win-win, Robert. I mean, this was really
That's right.
brilliant forethought and planning on Hill's part. The railroad
Yeah. If we
grows
back up,
as
just
the railroad grows as the area grows, and the area grows as the
yes.
railroad is there to assist in shipping and freight traffic. This was a win-win. This was really uh, a brilliant plan by James J. Hill.
Yeah. So two things. If I'll just back up real fast. During the Civil War, he couldn't fight because of his eye, his blindness, but he organized many Minnesota volunteers. He's still relatively young at this time, but he's industrious, and he finds a way to bale hay so the horses can he could feed them and turn that into a profit making business. Then later on, he wants to build this line into Canada because he's from Canada himself. And the Canadian government's like, no, 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 we don't want American railroads up here. We got our own thing going on. So that's when he veers west. It was the Red River Transport. That was a spot going north, and then instead of going into Canada, he veers west. And as you said, Andy, as you said a couple of weeks ago, remember looked at the Lewis and Clark route that they took. Much of that Hill followed. Okay, and
Right.
not only did so we're talking first of all about the immigrants and the industry, but even the natives. He was not hostile. He didn't just go in and take over their lines. He actually paid them. He was on good terms with them. They had no idea what this iron horse was when they saw it coming in. When they saw his railroads, they were like stupefied, seeing
Right.
something
Right.
so incredible and gigantic. But he's going on, going farther west. And at the time, he commits to building a transcontinental railroad. I mean, again, this is right out of Atlas Shrugged. Now he's integrating ore, he's integrating coal, steel, copper, all of the industries in Atlas Shrugged. You know, we got all the heroes like all merged into one man. From Russia, he imports the wheat that can grow in that terrain, so that it could now grow in the American North in the frigid air there. And when he says he wants to build this transcontinental, there's already three or four lines going on with businessmen who are cronyist. They're in bed with the government. They have subsidies from the government, and everyone's laughing at Hill. You'll never succeed. They called it Hill's folly, right? That was the term. And he's like, I'm not dealing with the government. I'm doing this on my own, completely privately investing, and just a principled man. On top of everything else, Andy, principle. This is one reason we like him so much. Again, right out of Atlas Shrugged. I don't want anything to do with the government. All they do is get in the way. One of his quotes is, "There's just far too much legislation in this country. Just leave me alone. Get out of
Imagine if
my
he was
way. I'll
alive
build."
today. Imagine if he was alive today.
Right. Yeah, yeah. But all these
You know what
different
reminds
industries, he goes. Go ahead,
Let
Andy.
me
Yeah. Mhm.
interrupt a second. You know what reminds me of that great line from Ronald Reagan? He said the nine most terrifying words in
Yes.
the English
Yes.
language. I'm from the government and I'm here
Hmm.
to help. Right?
Hmm. Right.
Yeah,
Amazing. Yeah.
understood that. You know, a couple of things, Robert, before you go on. Uh, One of those guys who built the earlier railroads with government money and government land and everything, uh, you know, they just wanted to get money from the government. The government paid them per mile, of track laid, so it didn't
Yes.
matter, if there was a lot of if the grades were steep or if there was intense curvature, it didn't matter.
Hmm.
They got paid. Doesn't matter how inefficient the line was. They got paid per mile of track laid. And they said it was said about one of those guys that what was the quote? Something like he rushed into the wilderness to get his land subsidies, or rushed into the wilderness
Yeah.
to get his government money.
Yes.
Whereas Hill
Yeah.
knew how to build a railroad. You know, Hill
Hmm.
Hill did not.
Hmm.
Uh, in fact, his own credo was, yeah, I wrote it down. Hill said, quote, "We want the best possible line, shortest distances, lowest grades, and least curvature we can build," unquote. Because
Yeah.
that means the most efficient line. It's the most inexpensive line to run, which means we could profit at lower freight rates than the other lines can. And again, it's a win-win. What did he say? Something like, "We don't admire Rocky Mountain scenery enough to
No,
put money into observing it, or something like that.
that's
Want the
right.
shortest
Yeah.
distances, the lowest grade, and the least amount of curvature." That means the most inexpensive, the most efficient, inexpensive line to run. That's what Hill.
Hmm.
That's how Hill built, and he built it slowly, like you said. He got it right.
Yeah. That's right. So, in Burton Folsom's book, Entrepreneurs versus the State, Henry Villard is the one that you just quoted, Andy. Who rushed into the wilderness to collect his subsidies, and he also contrasts Leland Stanford, who Stanford University is named after. Folsom calls them political entrepreneurs. I don't think that's a good term. They're not entrepreneurs. They're just cronyists who know how to go in and get subsidies from the government. And once you're in bed with the government, when things go well, you also suffer when things go downhill, and that was one of the things
Yes. Well,
that
Stanford,
happened with them.
Stanford, Stanford was governor of California. I think he was U.S. senator from California, and he controlled the politics
Yeah,
for the notorious Big Four. Was it the
that's right.
Southern Pacific? Was that
Hmm.
the Southern Pacific Railroad? And they bled. They had a monopoly, government franchise monopoly, and they could charge any rates they
Yeah.
want. They bled because uh, the California state legislature legally prohibited any competitor from entering the
Hmm.
field, and they bled California shippers for decades. At the late 19th, turn of the 20th century. Frank Norris's novel
Which is why,
Documents.
right, that's
Frank
right.
Norris's
Which is
novel
why
Documents
North.
is based on.
Yes, I'm sorry, Andy. That's
Yeah,
why Hill stayed north of California. He wanted no part of that. And Seattle, so it ended in Seattle, which was just this sleepy town. There was nothing really in Seattle. But once Hill succeeded, 1893, he completed the line, January of 1893. And then later on in 1893, there was a panic, financial panic, and the big four, they all went bankrupt. So they depended on the government, and then they went bankrupt. And Hills, not only did he thrive and succeed and thrive, but then he saw the Orient. He had his eyes since he was a teenager on the Orient, shipping to Japan. He wanted to have trade with Japan. He sent cotton over there. He sent coal, other supplies between Japan, textiles from New England, all the way to China as well. So now Seattle's becoming this big city, and that's why they have a statue of Hill. Uh, Hopefully, it hasn't been defaced or anything. I haven't been there in a while, but the point is, he turned. If you look at the line from St. Paul, Minnesota, all the way to Seattle, there are these little towns. And Andy, one interesting thing is that many of those small towns were named after bankers who loaned the money. They have like the actual names of individuals who just funded the money. And then there's a lot of towns named after Hill. There's a Hillsborough and Hillsdale and all these other names.
right.
So I mean, just his legacy is astonishing.
Yeah, it's and even filtered into American literature because if you
Yes.
read F. Scott Fitzgerald's great novel, The Great Gatsby. Um,
Yeah.
Well, at Gatsby's funeral, somebody, I think it was his dad, said
His
said
father.
that
Yes.
if he had lived long enough, he would have been a great man like James J. Hill. He would have built up the country. Now, Gatsby was a bootlegger, so that may or may not be true of him, but it was definitely true of Hill. He built up the country. We discussed how he did it,
Yeah.
and it's just an
And
extraordinary story of
and
building
also,
up
Andy.
in the industry and the
So
agriculture
within
of the American Northwest. Go ahead.
mhm.
Go ahead.
Sticking with that quote, with that Fitzgerald quote, yeah, Gatsby would not have been a Hill, but what he's saying is that's the ideal that you're striving
Right.
for. Towards
Right.
the end of his life, they called him the empire builder. Now, I don't like that. The empire has a lot of connotations, and that's why I prefer private empire, because everything he did was through private, personal effort. And um, but before there's one section we talked about the Rocky Mountains, Andy, which I wanted you to
Yeah.
bring up. Steve,
Yeah.
let's talk a
Yeah. I
little
was
about
going.
John Stevens.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
going to
Hmm.
mention the legendary Mariah's past,
Yes.
but before we even get there, we should point out. Excuse me. Hill was a tough guy. I mean, physically, he did long hours behind his desk, but
Yes.
he'd also ride out on horseback into this rugged terrain, mapping out the best path for his railroad. Again, he wanted the lowest grades. You do not want steep climbs over through the mountains. You want the lowest grades. You want the least curvature, straight line. This was and the shortest distances, and he'll spend a lot of time. They say, and he knew like every locomotive on his line. He knew every engineer on his line. He knew I mean,
This is Dagny
he was
Taggart, Andy, right?
yeah, right, yes,
It's
and
Dagny Taggart.
Yeah, Dagny Taggart in Atlas Shrugged, correct. And in real
Mhm.
life, Andrew Carnegie, they say, knew the steel. Everything you want to know about the steel industry, Carnegie knew. Rockefeller,
Mhm.
anything you want to know about the oil industry, Rockefeller knew it well. Hill knew everything about railroading, right down like every inch of his tracks.
Mhm.
And he must have known personnel too, because he hired as his chief engineer, John Stevens, who is a legendary
Yeah.
figure in his own right. It is an extraordinary story. So let me, I just happen
Mhm.
coincidentally, Rob, to have a copy of the Capitalist Manifesto here.
Yeah, pretty
Um,
cool. Got my own too.
yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, I hear this is a
I like
pretty
that
good
book.
book. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm going to read something from it in just a minute. But the Marias Pass
Mhm.
through the Montana Rockies was legendary. Lewis and Clark had actually discovered it and written about it in 1805. And here we are 80 years
Mhm.
later. Nobody knew where it was. Or even
Mhm.
if it existed, they thought maybe it's just a legend. Uh, and that boggles my mind. It's 80 years later. But, this reminds
Yeah.
me of when we were discussing Magellan. It was like
Yeah.
only
Mhm.
60 years later that another great seaman, Sir Francis Drake, was able to locate the Straits of Magellan, and then, navigate his way through it. Well, uh, Hill sent out his chief engineer, and John Stevens was more than an engineer. He was also a rugged frontiersman
That's
and
right.
an
Yeah.
outdoorsman. Now, Stevens
Mhm.
dates were 1853 to 1943. So let me go. Let's go to the videotape here and tell this part of the story. Hill employed the stellar engineer John Stevens, who became a legendary figure for his discovery of the almost mythical Marias Pass. Lewis and Clark had described a low pass through the Montana Rockies in 1805, but 8 decades later, nobody knew where it was or even if it existed. But Hill recognized that Stevens, who was part engineer and part explorer, was the man to find it. Stevens represented the beau ideal of Victorian manhood. Ramrod straight, ruggedly handsome, and self confident, he headed into the mountains in the dead of December. I think I might have waited till spring, Robert, but that's
Yeah.
just me. Headed to the Rockies in the dead of December with a lone Indian companion. Trundling on snowshoes through heavy snows, they approached the headwaters of the Marias River. When the brutal conditions caused his guide to refuse to go further, Stevens, who in his life had survived Mexican fevers, Indian attack, Canadian blizzards, and an episode in which he had been treed by wolves, intrepidly continued alone. On the night of the yeah, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, this is
No,
great.
no.
This guy, they, they,
Yeah.
they need to make this into a movie. Stevens rediscovers the
Yes.
Mariah's past. On the night of
Mhm.
December 11th, this is like Jeremiah Johnson, their old Robert Redford film. On the night of December 11th, 1889, stomping through the long pre-dawn hours in minus 40-degree cold, Stevens found the pass he sought. Marias Pass, along the southern border of today's Glacier National Park, lies at only
Mhm.
5,215 feet elevation, the lowest crossing of
Mhm.
the northern Rockies. The result avoidance of grades and curvature spelled out the Torah of Hill's credo, a highly efficient, low-cost line that could, better than any competitor, carry long-distance cargoes of heavy tonnage. Got to keep those
Amazing.
grades low when you're
Yeah.
going through
Yeah.
when you're going through the mountains. Much less
Yeah.
expensive that way, right? And
And do you remember?
Steve is a legendary figure himself. Go ahead.
Yeah, treed by wolves, Andy. Let's explain that. What does that mean if you're treed by wolves? That means you
Well,
gotta hang out in a
I
tree
mean,
until wolves go away. They're down, they're gonna eat you. And you gotta hang out until they get tired and go away, and then you can come down the tree and escape. I
yeah,
mean, that's
yeah. Fortunately, it wasn't a
amazing.
bear because bears can climb, right? But wolves are closer
Yeah,
than dogs, and
yeah,
they
yeah.
don't climb. Well, mountain lions who can also, they're cats. They could also climb. I was thinking, I don't know if Stevens had a gun when he was treated by wolves. I'm not sure, but if he did, if the wolves were starving, he might have shot one of the wolves, and then they would have eaten the dead wolf. I don't want to test hypothesis. I don't want to find out.
No,
So.
right. But
But
that
one other
story is
thing, Rob.
also in David McCullough's book on the Panama Canal, because Stevens went on. This is
Well,
why we got to talk to him more. Eventually, I think we should cover.
that's where I
Pan-
got the story. That's where I
yeah.
got this
Okay.
from
Exactly.
David
Yeah.
McCullough.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. The
but
pat.
one other thing, Andy. So
Wait,
sticking
wait.
with Stevens, when he told Hill the cost, Hill is yelling at him. No, that's too much. And Stevens stayed calm and cool, and he's like, "Look, this is what it costs. We can't do it any other way." And Hill understood, and then he backed down. And so here's the respect. It's one thing to have this vision, and like you just said, it's really important. He went on every grade. Hill experienced every line, every mile of track that his trains. Again, this is Dagny Taggart, as opposed to her brother Jim Taggart in the Fountainhead, who never did any of that. Just like the big four monopolists and ones who went bankrupt. So, but Hill understood. He hired the best men, and even if he was loud with them, cursed at them, once they reasoned with him and said this is the way to be done, he gave them the full go ahead.
Yes, Rob, you're right. You're referring to Stevens discovered a second pass. This is through the Cascade Mountains in
Yes,
Washington,
that's right.
which is known as
Washington. Yes.
Stevens Pass. And several
Hmm.
years later, he designed a tunnel to go through that terrain, which greatly cut the distances and the grades and the cost. But at first,
Hmm.
they had to go up over the mountain where they could, and it required switchbacks,
Yeah.
zigzagging up the mountain, which was enormously expensive. It took a lot of the efficiency out of Hill's tightly built line. That's the story you're talking about. Hill got out his train, barreled west when he heard what this was going to cost, and he had a legendary temper. He just
Yeah.
exploded at Stevens. Are you crazy? This switchbacks back and forth over this mountain is going to take all the efficiency and all the savings out of our line. It's going to
Hmm.
undermine our ability to make a profit at low freight rates and so on and so forth. And you're right. They say Stevens just let his boss explode, waited him out, and then explained, "Boss, I hear you. It's the only way. There's no other way to do it until we
Yeah.
build the tunnel. There's no other way to get over the mountain." And Hill recognized it. And I don't know, and signed off on it. Stevens was right. It was the only way until they built the tunnel.
Yeah. And some of those, I've seen some pictures of those tracks, and it's like majestic. I mean, it's going through the pass. It's just amazing. It's one of those incredible feats of engineering to see that. The Cascades in the eastern part of Washington State.
Hmm.
And if we go back, Andy, to the immigrants, 42,000 was the number. That's how many immigrants came in from Europe, mostly Scandinavian. And when you think of, even to this day, like people in Minnesota, they tend to be in the northern part of the states. I always thought when I was young, well, it's the same kind of weather, and that's why they are there. But how did they get there? You had to have money to leave those poor places, and you didn't get there for free. And Hill was the one that gave them that incentive. So a lot of the descendants today, to this day, are from Hill's idea, Hill's payment, for them to come, settle, cultivate the land, turn it into something valuable. And as we said earlier, he did this part by part. It was calibrated for maximum efficiency, and then built these towns, and then became industry. And again, this is what, even I think in Atlas Shrugged, with the wheat, with the bumper crop that they have in Minnesota, and this is exactly what was going on. That Hill was transporting all this wheat. He even said at one point, wheat is more important than cotton. Cotton is king. That was the thing. And this is after the Civil War. They were still dependent on cotton. But he's like, no, this is what feeds people. Wheat is what feeds people. I mean, it's before the paleo movement. I could say that, but certainly at the time, it was, and he looked for ways to develop the soil. Science was, he was scientific as well. Like, so he reason was just like front and center for this man. He had this vision, and it just seemed like even if he blew his top, he listened to reason that Stevens gave him. So just all these virtues, as I say, they just come right out of Atlas Shrugged. It's just uncanny
Yeah.
that I think of that novel with J.J. Hill.
Yeah, and being a genius and a man of exemplary rationality does not preclude having an explosive temper. You could
No.
explode and get it all out, your frustration, and then when you vented, then you look at the hard data, like Stevens gave him the hard data of getting
Yeah.
across the Cascades, and really, yeah, rationally, there's just boss, there's just no other way right now. And and Hill always responded to reason. You're right.
Mhm.
He was a man of reason. That's how he built his private empire. So
Yeah.
this is an extraordinary story. Should we discuss Northern Securities with Morgan and Harriman
Let's
and
so we've kind of hit the peak, and then unfortunately the country goes, yes, let's go into Northern Securities and what that
right?
meant to the country and the future of
Yeah,
the nation.
this is a sad story. You know, and we discussed part of it when we did the Edward H. Harriman episode,
Yeah.
right? But anyway, there
Mhm.
was Harriman, of course, came out of banking, recognized Hill's genius in railroading, bought those mismanaged lines that had been built with
Union
government money
Pacific.
and government.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Union
Hmm.
Pacific was known as a what was it? A rusted streak. It was just they said it was just a rusted streak of iron. I think is how it
Yeah.
was described. And Harriman built up the Union Pacific, and the Central Pacific. And I think eventually the Southern Pacific. Harriman built them up along Hill specifications. Built them the same way, and they were tremendously, successful. They were built to rival the Hill's Great Northern. Well, there was a,
Hmm.
a stock war between Harriman's group and Hill's
Yes.
group for the Northern Pacific, the control of the Northern
Hmm.
Pacific, right? And the stock price kept rising. Hill, I think, was in Seattle. He was in the Northwest. Morgan was wait. He was Morgan, J.P. Morgan had recognized Hill's genius. Morgan was an upper crust, waspy gentleman, and Hill was a rough and tumble Westerner. But Morgan, recognized this guy's a genius in railroading. He funded him. Morgan was away in Europe. Hill I think, was in Seattle. Was suspicious about the rise in how the NP, the Northern Pacific stock price, kept rising. Got on a train, barreled across the country into New York City, come into Wall Street, angry, and the resulting stock war. Uh, Hill and Morgan retained control of the Northern Pacific, but Harriman and I think it was Jacob Schiff was his Wall Street
And
banker.
and Rockefeller, one of the Rockefeller sons as well. Hmm.
Yeah, they had carved out a large minority ownership,
Yes.
of the Northern Pacific. And Morgan, who was the great railroad organizer, that organized all these lines, all the Hill and the Harriman lines, into one super company, or trust, as it was known back then,
Hmm.
Northern Securities Trust. And this was an extraordinary. I mean, you had Hill and Harriman running these railroads. These were the most.
The two top brains in all of transportation.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. These are two top railroad men in the country at the turn of the 20th century. These lines were enormously efficient. They had brought, because they were so efficient, like I said, this is we need to stress this about the great businessmen. Efficiency means that you lower costs. Rockefeller did it brilliantly at Standard Oil and was able to sell oil at a price so low he permanently undercut all his competitors. Carnegie did it at Carnegie Steel. He brought the price of steel, of a ton of steel, way down, making it possible to build
Hmm.
skyscrapers and automobiles, and and farm equipment, and railroads, and so on and so forth. And Hill and Harriman did it in railroading. They brought the price because they were so efficient. They could still make a profit even when they lowered the freight rates dramatically. Didn't matter to
Hmm.
President Theodore Roosevelt, who was a very, very mixed case. Did some good things, but did a lot of really bad things in his
This was one of his
career. He
worst.
Yeah,
Hmm.
he was determined to bust up Northern Securities, claiming it was a monopoly, which wasn't even true because there were other transcontinental lines, going to the West Coast.
Hmm.
But even if it was true, it was irrelevant. Like Rockefeller at Standard Oil, I don't know, he had like 85 or 90% of market share, I think, in the United States. But that was because,
Hmm.
like I said, he was so efficient. He could make a profit by permanently underselling his competitors, and that's what Hill and
Yeah.
Harriman did. They were so efficient. They consistently and persistently undersold any competitor, which means the shippers, whether the farmers or the industrialists, are benefiting, which means, of course, the customers are benefiting because, the shippers are getting lower freight rates, which means they could sell in the
Hmm.
marketplace at lower prices. Didn't matter to Teddy
Yeah.
Roosevelt. They were big companies. Somehow they were dangerous. He wanted to break them up. And eventually, a few years later, early 20th century, 1904 maybe, was it?
Yeah.
By
Before was the case. Yep.
SCOTUS,
Mhm.
yeah, SCOTUS judgment, Northern Securities was broken up, into many companies, breaking up this enormously efficient uh, super railroad holding company. But one of the things I really like about it is Hill recognized, you know, how great their business was and how evil the politicians were. He said something like, "It's really hard." I don't remember his exact words, but to the effect, "It's really hard when we remember the way we how hard we worked to build up the Northwest to be." Hampered or restricted or broken up by politicians who never did anything but pose and get a salary. Yeah,
Yes.
the politicians never did
Yeah.
anything but pose, and
Hmm.
draw a salary. Now, you read the historians on this, and they're flabbergasted by Hill. To them, Hill and these guys are clearly robber barons. Teddy Roosevelt is clearly a
Yes.
progressive, acting in
Yes.
the
Hmm.
public interest. And one historian, I think it was
Hmm.
Richard Hofstadter, said, he was like flabbergasted. He said, "Well, Hill evidently really believed what he was saying, as if the furthest thing from his mind was that Hill was right, on this,
Right.
and Roosevelt was dead wrong. But Hill was right on this, and Roosevelt was dead wrong. And this is a sad beginning to government intrusion and into the marketplace and breaking up an
Yeah.
enormously productive company."
Yeah, before that decision, Andy, the Sherman Antitrust Act was rarely exercised. There were a lot of cases, but they weren't. They didn't succeed. But once Teddy Roosevelt came in and the high publicity 5-4 ruling in favor of the government, then it just snowballed. And of course, the ideology of the time, the progressive movement, was in full gear. So that's what all the media reported. Like you just said, there was no way people thought what Hill was doing was good because they were told he was a monopolist and they were told he was an empire builder in a negative sense, and that um, he treated his workers unfairly. And again, this is a man that's bringing all these people in, thousands, 42,000 immigrants, to live and to work and to do all these things where they had no other choice before, of making a livelihood. And so, yeah, that decision. Some said that kind of broke his spirit. He did live another 10 or so years, but he never went full in. Just think of Andy, think of the psychology where you put your entire life's work into something, and then, as you just quoted him saying, and then some politician who never did anything but pose has the power to take that away from you. Imports to Japan went down 40%. We talk about Bastiat, the seen and the unseen. This was the unseen. Roosevelt gets headlines for busting this trust. Labor workers, they get their increase in wage. There was a big socialist union guy that butted heads with Hill as well. I can't remember his name right now, um, but the point here is that all of that efficiency went out the window, and it was for these headlines, trade with the Far East, his big dream of making this international agreement, again, Bastiat, where where countries don't have borders, they instead of armies they trade. Then there's there that's everybody wins in that scenario. So all of these things were part of Hill, um, of his achievements. And then just moving on later on in his life, he turns to philanthropy. He's getting older. He builds this massive mansion in St. Paul, a library modeled after the Morgan Library. Collects artwork, beautiful artwork that he has in different galleries. So, and this is what many of in that era, especially, which again you call it not the Gilded Age, right? What do you call it? I'll let you say that.
And
You have
in the Capitalist
definitely
Manifesto, I renamed it the inventive period.
the
It's the
inventive
inventive
period,
period.
because all of these inventions and all of these life-saving and life-increasing devices, this is when standard of living was just raising for everybody dramatically, from what it was 10, 15 post-Civil War period, when that whole terrain was just vast, and just some natives who never really cultivated the land. These are the things that Hill had built, and so he's turning his attention now to these more local activities. We didn't talk about his marriage, but he had 10 kids, 10 children with his wife. No scandals to my knowledge. I don't know. Probably I would have heard of them, because those things always tend to jump out when people give biographies. He turned to writing himself. He wrote a couple of books on, on his methods, on an advocate of free trade. Andy, again, imagine today, if we go to today's period, when some of the best businessmen, sadly, many of them are forced to be partners with government, but some of them are not, and they are more principled. But how many stand up and actually say, no, the government is crossing the line, this is not their business? And that's one of the things that Hill was very good at. Total advocate of free
Yes,
trade.
yes. I mean, he was just a great man in so many
Hmm.
ways. There's so many things that could be said for Hill, but just
Yeah.
building up the American Northwest was an
Yes.
extraordinary accomplishment on his part. He was a visionary,
Yeah.
and again, to reiterate, recognize that my line will grow only as the area grows, and the area will
Yeah.
grow, with my line. My line will spur that growth. And one last thing I'd want to say about Hill, from what I read
Hmm.
about him, all this the work, that was his motto: hard work, intelligent work, then more
Yes.
work,
Yeah.
which he lived out. He lived out his credo in real time. Hill never took a
Yeah.
salary
No.
from the Great North, right? Never took a salary.
Never. He
He owned a
only
lot of
made his
stock.
money on stock. That's
Yeah,
right.
right.
He made his money when he was like 13, 14. He said, "My goal is to have $100,000." Okay. No, by 1916, if we just cover the end of his life, he's getting sicker. He's 77 years old. The two Mayo brothers from the Mayo Clinic go to his home, his mansion, and try to help him, but it was too late, too little, too late. And
Was
so
he suffering
May,
from cancer? Was it cancer? What was it that eventually he died of? I'm not sure.
actually, that's a good question. I don't remember specifically,
Yeah,
but he
I
had
don't either.
ailments that, yeah, he had ailments, and the Mayo brothers couldn't fix him. So May 29th, he fell into a coma, and died. And then May 31st, Andy, this is an act of justice. All of his workers, all the trains, 2 p.m. local time, they all stopped and had a 5 minute moment of silence in honor of Hill. So this man was, I mean, this is what I love about doing the hero show, Andy, because how many teenagers know who JJ Hill is? Okay. How many people in their 20s know his backstory? This should be part of American history in everybody's class. And we get to celebrate him. I get to dig deeper into this man who I've known for decades. I've known bits and pieces, but in doing the episode, I'm like, Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged, right here, boom, boom, boom. All
Yeah.
these different industries that he connected, and so some of my favorite quotes, Andy. He says, "I will
Let me
make
say
my
one.
mark on the face." Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
I just want to say one last thing about not drawing a salary.
Yeah,
Because he owned stock, and he made money as the only as the value of the stock increased. There's more financial incentive to succeed, because if I don't succeed,
yes,
the value I don't have any salary to fall back on. The value of the stock declines. I'm not going to be
yeah.
making any money. But if I succeed and build up the railroad and build up the Northwest, then the stock value will rise, and my personal fortune will rise. So this, it's like he built in a personal financial incentive to his own success. It's nicely done. It's very congruent
Yeah,
with everything else that the way he operated in his career.
yeah. And Andy, thank you for bringing that up again, because that's what he expected of others. So when it came time to cut rates, to cut wages, when there was a depression going on, there was this outrage. How can you do this? And the labor union, strike walkouts, because they demanded, again, the wealth inequality was all they saw. But guess what? Those workers making $5 a day were actually getting paid $5 a day more than Hill was, because he was working for free. He was working 20-hour days, knowing everything about the business. And later on in life, he goes into timber. He goes into banking. All the timber in the Midwest that didn't exist, in the eastern Washington state, just launched this new industry out of things that were just there in nature. He's the one that reshaped that. So just a couple of quick quotes. Andy says, "I will make my mark on the face of this earth, and no man will ever wipe it out." And this is what I think is the act of justice here.
Yeah.
Ayn Rand in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, refers to Hill and his success and his legacy, and and how the government railroaded him in the negative sense, calling back to your introduction. And
Right.
and he says most men who have really lived have had in some shape their great adventure. This railway is mine. So it's like that's his great adventure. That's his life. Is this achievement? The Great Northern is it's just a
Yep.
statement of his life.
And the Great Northern Railroad is still up and running. More than
Yeah,
100 years
yeah.
after his death. And as
Amtrak.
last
I
point,
think Amtrak has some of it now, right? I'm pretty sure that. Yeah, actually, thank you, Dylan, for showing that. Yeah, couple of quotes here on that. This last one that I read. There's a plaque, memorializing him again, calling him the the empire builder, and he just he put it out there. He spoke convincingly about what his life was and his impact was, and free trade was essential to that. Basically, leave me alone, and I will build. You know, I will build, and people will come, and that's exactly what happened. And they're still
and
there,
that's
generations and generations later.
well, I can attest to that. Having gone to college in South Dakota,
Yeah.
I know
Hmm.
a lot of people there are, one, of Scandinavian descent, and two, many of them know, at least when I was in college, this was a while ago, but knew who James J. Hill was, and how instrumental he was in building up the American
Yeah.
Northwest. So
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
we've done the great man justice,
Yeah, I
and I
agree.
think we could
Hmm.
I think we could salute the great James J. Hill. And I want to wish you, Robert, and everybody else out there in Hero Land, let's strive to have a more heroic day, and let's seek to lead more heroic lives, to be inspired by these great men and women that we're discussing. And we will be
Hmm.
back with more heroism next
Next week.
week on the Hero Show.